We have told the world that Princess Araya died of a fever, and that is broadly true. But it was a fever such as I have never seen before, and hope to never see again. The girl was burning. Her skin was flushed and red, and when I laid my hand upon her brow to learn how hot she was, it was as if I had thrust it into a pot of boiling oil. There was scarce an ounce of flesh upon her bones, so gaunt and starved did she appear, but we could observe certain swellings inside her, as her skin bulged out and then sunk down again, as if— no, not as if, for this was the truth of it. There were things inside her, living things, moving and twisting, mayhaps searching for a way out, and giving her such pain that even milk of the poppy gave her no surcease. We told the king, as we must surely tell her mother, that Araya never spoke, but that is a lie. I pray that I shall soon forget some of the things she whispered through her cracked and bleeding lips. I cannot forget how oft she begged for death. Hey everyone, Crowfood's daughter here, and if you click this video, you have reached the Disputed Lands. In today's video, we will be moving into part 2 of our analysis. This will be the second installment within a series dedicated to explaining the origins of dragon lore, and will be best understood if you have viewed part 1, which is linked in the description box below. So if you have not viewed that already, go ahead and do that now. Now, in part 1, we discussed the hypothesis of Septim Barth, who suggested that Valyria had created dragons through blood magic and sorcery. And in doing so, we discovered numerous references supporting this mixture of wyvern and fireworm. However, there was one confounding issue: the evidence to suggest dragons existed prior to the founding of the Valyrian freehold. With those concepts in mind, we will be delving even deeper into the histories and mysteries of the great empire and Valyria, and in doing so, uncover the origin of dragons and the Valyrian race. Now let's get started. So, dragons. In part 1, we discussed Septim Barth and his hypothesis on the origin of dragons, while uncovering evidence to suggest Valyrian sorcery and a mixing of wyvern and fireworm being the case for dragon creation. And there were several things to support this. For example, we have a man who is consistently right presenting the suggestion. We also have information from both the World Book and the Kindly Man suggesting both creatures being kin to dragons. This mixing of genetics would also account for all characteristics of both structure and function dragons possess. And when examining Targaryen stillbirths, the possession of both wyvern and fireworm genetics justifies the many twisted deformities that have occurred, such as wings, scales, eyeless, blind, or limbless features. In addition to all this, we also discussed several hints, metaphor, and wordplay throughout the series to suggest this origin, with the most telling being the wingless, maggot-white, and blind worm hatched from Laena Targaryen's dragon egg. Now, in spite of everything laid out in part 1 to support Valyrian blood magic and sorcery, a conundrum was presented. The evidence to suggest dragons existed prior to the founding of the Valyrian freehold. Architectural evidence of fused stone structures in both Westeros and the Five Forts suggests the great Empire of the Dawn both possessed and controlled dragons, in addition to several ancient histories and legends supporting this origin as well. In Ashai, the tales are many and confused, but certain texts, all impossibly ancient, claim that dragons first came from the shadow, a place where all of our learning fails us. These Ashai histories say that a people so ancient they had no name first tamed dragons in the shadow and brought them to Valyria, teaching the Valyrians their arts before departing from the annals. So, with all the confounding information at hand, we now come to the big question. Was it the Valyrians who worked blood magic and sorcery to create dragons as the evidence suggests? Or did the Great Empire of the Dawn first have dragons, as the evidence also suggests? When looking at the information at hand, especially the new details contained in Fire and Blood, I must say, Septon Barth's hypothesis does appear to be the case. But with that being said, we know there are legends and histories to suggest dragons were first tamed in the Shadow, and we see the Five Forts, a structure of fused stone, and we know they had to have had a dragon there, possibly several, to have built a structure of fused stone 1,000 feet high, dwarfing even the wall of Westeros, and we have architectural evidence in Old Town as well. So we know dragons were there. Ultimately, in order to wrap our heads around this topic, we need to first understand the relationship the Great Empire and Valyria once had. If you were to watch History of Westeros' episodes on the Great Empire and Asshai, you will know that the Valyrian civilization is likely a descendant of the more ancient civilization of the Great Empire. This means that there is an intertwining connection between the two civilizations, as one is simply a precursor to the other. So, knowing it is highly likely that dragons were created through blood magic, if this is the case, this sorcery did not occur with the Valyrians, but rather with the Great Empire of the Dawn, making the claims that an ancient people first tamed dragons in the Shadow and taught the Valyrians their arts start to make sense, because the Great Empire was merely the ancestor and forebearer to the Valyrian civilization. And there are a few hints to support this. For example, there appears to be evidence of the Great Empire having settlements within Sothoryos. You see, oily black stone is a mysterious material found in only a handful of locations, and interestingly enough, there are only 2 locations known to have been constructed entirely of this material. One of these locations is, of course, Asshai, an incredibly ancient and mysterious city that has dragon origin legends surrounding it and was once part of the Great Empire. The second location, built entirely of the same material, is coincidentally the ruined city of Yin in Sothoryos. Now, considering this similarity in building construction being unique to only these 2 locations, this may be providing us with clues of the presence of the Great Empire in Yin in the distant past. Like Asshai, Yin is an incredibly ancient and mysterious city with similar descriptions that is located on the very same continent wyverns are said to inhabit, and is located just south and west of Wyvern Point. But moreover, directly before we learn of Yin and these connections, we also learn of some fantastical and disturbing races of men. Some say that there were other races here once, forgotten peoples destroyed, devoured, or driven out by the brindled men. Tales of lizard men, lost cities, and eyeless cave dwellers are commonplace. No proof exists for any of these. Maesters and scholars alike have puzzled over the greatest of the enigmas of Sothoryos, the ancient city of Yin. In addition to hints of the Great Empire having a footprint in Sothoryos, we see mention of brindled men, lizard men, lost cities, eyeless cave dwellers, directly prior to Yin being discussed. These tales are interesting because just beyond the 5 forts of the Great Empire, we also find tales of lizard men and other similarly disturbing races, such as bloodless men and winged men. So, fun fact, after the publication of the World Book, there was heavy speculation throughout the fandom on what these races in Sothoryos and beyond the 5 forts could be, and a popular theory was the possibility these races were half-humans or hybrids of some kind, or even failed attempts of blood magic, especially when it came to the concept of dragons and dragon creation. And there is rationale behind this, because in Sothoryos, we have men described as lizard men, and others described as brindled, and there is a species of wyvern in Sothorios known as the brindled wyvern. Then, beyond the 5 forts of the Great Empire, we also find tales of lizard men and also winged men, who are said to soar on leathern wings, and these descriptions seem to align quite well with traits found in wyverns or dragons. What people hadn't caught, however, were the eyeless cave dwellers and the bloodless men, and how these races might also fit into the equation. But before we answer this mystery, we first need to understand the connotation of the term bloodless and how it is used in the series, because the word bloodless could really mean a lot of things. Luckily, however, the term bloodless is used several times within the series, and when actual people are described as bloodless or looking bloodless, time and time again, it is a word used to describe someone who looks very pale. Let's take a look. Sansa saw Sir Barristan and the king's brother Renly, and the short man who had talked to her so oddly and touched her hair, but no one made a move to interfere. The queen's face was a mask, so bloodless that it might have been sculpted from snow. She rose from the table, gathered her skirts around her, and stormed off in silence. The bride was shivering too. They had dressed her in white lamb's wool trimmed with lace. Her sleeves and bodice were sewn with freshwater pearls, and on her feet were white doeskin slippers, pretty but not warm. Her face was pale, bloodless. Cersei plucked a hair from beneath his chin and held it up. It was gray. All the color is draining out of you, brother. You've become a ghost of what you were, a pale, crippled thing, and so bloodless, always in white. She flicked the hair away. I prefer you garbed in crimson and gold. As you can see, this is a somewhat thematic description. So, when taking into consideration how this term is used within the series, a people described as bloodless men is quite likely a race who are extremely pale. Now, if you recall in part 1, we discovered 2 traits the fireworm is likely to possess. Fireworms are likely blind or eyeless and lack pigment, similar to Laena Targaryen's hatchling, the fish in Bloodraven's cape, and the worms depicted in our author's other works. So, when taking the traits of the fireworm into consideration, these eyeless cave dwellers and bloodless men might also be hints of this hybrid experimentation, as their descriptions match the 2 features fireworms likely possess. So, when looking more closely at these races described in both Sothorios and beyond the 5 forts of the Great Empire, we have brindled men, lizard men, winged men, eyeless cave dwellers, and bloodless men. We have what appear to be races of men with features mimicking those of wyverns or fireworms, which can, interestingly enough, be found echoed in the winged, scaled, and eyeless deformities seen in twisted Targaryen stillbirths. So, I know what you're thinking. Why? Why would the Great Empire create humans with such traits? What's the point? And what does this have to do with the creation of dragons? Well, as it turns out, in addition to fireworms and wyverns, there is evidence to suggest humans were also needed for dragon creation. From part 1, we learned there is likely truth to the Valyrian claims of possessing the blood of the dragon that was highlighted by features of Targaryen stillbirths and the death of Arya Targaryen. Now, with Arya Targaryen, we are going to go more in depth with this particular incident, because this is where the answers are going to lie. You see, Septon Barth had observed something astonishing in Arya Targaryen beyond the worms themselves, and that would be how her body was able to acclimate for these worms, described as creatures of heat and fire, in ways that the average person cannot. While not fireproof, There have been hints throughout the series and the Dunk and Egg Novellas to suggest that Targaryens do have a tolerance to heat, highlighted on several occasions. Maybe when they reached the stream, he'd have a soak. He smiled, thinking how good it would feel to jump right in and come up sopping wet and grinning, with water cascading down his cheeks and through his tangled hair, and his tunic clinging sodden to his skin. Egg might want a soak as well, though the boy looked cool and dry, more dusty than sweaty. He never sweated much. He liked the heat. In Dorne he went around bare-chested and turned brown as a Dornishman. It is his dragon blood, Dunk told himself. In addition to various clues throughout the series and Dunk and Egg Novellas, in a 2003 interview, our author even mentioned this resilience when asked if Targaryens are immune to fire. In response, he stated that while Targaryens are not immune to fire, they do possess the ability to tolerate more heat than the ordinary person. But it wasn't until the recent publication of Fire and Blood that we learned exactly how much heat resistance their bodies might actually possess. According to Septim Barth's accounts, "We have told the world that Princess Araya died of a fever, and that is broadly true, but it was a fever such as I have never seen before and hope to never see again. The girl was burning. Her skin was flushed and red, and when I laid my hand upon her brow to learn how hot she was, it was as if I had thrust it into a pot of boiling oil." While this comparison of thrusting one's hand into boiling oil seems like an exaggeration, Septim Barth goes on to recount, "All the maester's arts were powerless against her fever, if indeed we can call such a horror by such a commonplace name. The simplest way to say it is that the poor child was cooking from within. Her flesh grew darker and darker, and then began to crack until her skin resembled nothing so much, 7 save me, as pork cracklings. Thin tendrils of smoke issued from her mouth, her nose, even most obscenely from her nether lips. By then she had ceased to speak, though the things within her continued to move. Her very eyes cooked within her skull and finally burst, like 2 eggs left in a pot of boiling water for too long." So Araya's body became so hot that she was quite literally cooking from the inside, with smoke issuing from every orifice, her eyes bursting and her skin becoming cracked leather. Now, this description alone should have set off a few red flags, and for me, it definitely did. As you might already be aware, normal body temperature is somewhere around 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, with anything higher than around 108 being considered incompatible with the body and can lead to cell damage, organ failure, and possibly even death. Now, when we look at the upper limits of human survival, the highest recorded fever a human has ever endured and lived to tell the tale was a man named Willie Jones, who survived a temperature of 115 degrees Fahrenheit and holds the world record for the highest recorded body temperature. Now, when comparing these limits of the human body to that of what Araya's body was able to tolerate, this was indeed a superhuman feat. Araya was able to live with such extreme internal temperatures that her body was literally smoking and her eyes bursting. Even her skin seems to have added protection, with it hardening and turning to cracked leather rather than presenting like normal burns, where the skin would eventually slough away. So, by examining how these worms had set up residence inside Araya and how her body acclimated to those conditions, it is safe to say that her body was able to tolerate the extreme conditions that allowed these worms to thrive, making Araya's body the perfect host. So after understanding Valyrians share the blood of the dragon and recognizing this profound heat tolerance the dragon blood likely provides, it seems quite possible humans with these traits once served as vehicles or hosts for the blood magic involved in dragon creation, as the worms that burst out of Araya themselves also appear to be hybrids or chimeras of some sort, and had taken on unnatural features, such as hands and faces. Now, we don't have much information on how these worms came to live inside Araya, and we only know that it likely coincided with Balerion bringing her to Valyria. And we're not going to go into speculation on that today, but we are going to talk about a small detail regarding transmission. In his video on Araya Targaryen, which I've linked below, Quinn from Ideas of Ice and Fire points out that a possible outbreak might have been averted when Araya was lowered into ice and the worms were killed, which is an interesting and insightful take on his part, and it's one that made me wonder how these creatures might affect someone without dragon blood, who aren't equipped in the same way Araya's body was. It's likely the victims would die much faster, and the worms would not grow or proliferate the way Araya's had. But additionally, without this resistance, the victim might also present in a slightly different way, a way that we may have been given a glimpse of. According to the World Book, Gogossos was a Valyrian outpost that survived the Doom, and was infamous for its flesh pits and sorcery, where humans were said to be mated with beasts to bring forth twisted, half-human children. Now, after the Doom, Valyria itself was lost. Almost all dragons were destroyed and on the brink of extinction. Despite what happened to Valyria proper, several free cities and outposts remained, and among those was Gogossos, a settlement with a foul reputation, notorious for its blood magic and creating monstrosities. Knowing that almost all dragons were gone from the world after Valyria's destruction, the number one goal for Gogossos after the Doom was likely to recreate what was lost. Recreating dragons would have become a top priority for the blood mages of Gogossos, because dragons were the source of Valyria's power, the source of their strength, and Gogossos had literally everything they would need: blood magic, sorcery, flesh pits, even proximity to Sothorios and wyverns. Unfortunately, tragedy had befallen them, and a terrible plague was released. The infamy of Gogossos outlived even the Doom. During the Century of Blood, this dark city waxed rich and powerful. Some called her the 10th Free City, but her wealth was built on slaves and sorcery. Her slave markets became as notorious as those of the old Giscari cities on Slaver's Bay. 70 years after the Doom of Valyria, however, it is said their stink reached even the nostrils of the gods, and a terrible plague emerged from the slave pens of Gogossos. The Red Death swept across the Isle of Tears, and then the rest of the Basilisk Isles. 9 men of every 10 died screaming, bleeding copiously from every orifice, their skin shredding like wet parchment. So, a plague emerged from the slave pens, and 9 of every 10 men died screaming, bleeding from every orifice, with their skin shredding like parchment. So, consider for a moment that Gogossos might have indeed been intent on recreating dragons, and that humans were indeed part of this equation. Have you ever noticed the similarities of the Red Death and what had befallen Araya? Now, keeping in mind persons without dragon blood, like the slaves of Gogossos, might present slightly differently compared to Araya, and would not survive as long. Let's compare how the two are described. In the case of Araya, she experienced incredible pain, so much so that she begged for death, and even milk of the poppy gave her no relief. In Gogossos, it is said that its inhabitants had died screaming. Now, it is also said in Gogossos that blood had issued from every orifice of its victims. And with Araya, we get a similar phenomena, but rather than blood, tendrils of smoke issued from literally every possible orifice. And in Gogossos, it is said the Red Death victim's skin shredded like wet parchment. while Arya's skin experienced a phenomena where it had literally cooked and turned to cracked leather. Now, as I mentioned previously, with the way Arya's skin reacted, it appears her skin shared protective qualities as well, rather than presenting with the burns you would expect her to have, because if that was the case, she wouldn't have any skin left. You see, the skin is a fairly delicate protective layer of the body that serves several functions. However, when the skin is damaged by heat, a burn may result. Now, if that burn is severe enough, the skin will experience blistering and sloughing and can even take on the consistency of wet parchment and shred away. So, when comparing these similarities, I believe it is quite possible what befell Arya and what befell the slaves of Gogossos were likely the same phenomena, meaning that Gogossos was indeed in the process of trying to recreate dragons, but their blood mages seem to have lacked the understanding of how to accomplish this, or better put, who to use. With that in mind, we really need to look more closely at the relationship between the Great Empire and the earliest people that began the line of the Valyrian race. What is interesting here is that the Great Empire of the Dawn, a civilization with so much going for it, advanced architecture, technology, and dragons, fell. But not only did it fall, but despite several other civilizations such as Yi, Lang, and the Jogo Snai, and various other peoples likely descending from the Great Empire, the Valyrians were interestingly the only people to have retained dragons and dragon riding within their newfound society. Not only that, but the Valyrian race itself also seems to share a special bond to dragons that we generally do not see with other races. In fact, in addition to dragons and dragon bond, the Valyrians do not share any noticeable physical characteristics with any other peoples of the East, even those descending from the Great Empire. Valyrians are known to have strikingly distinct and unique features, such as purple eyes, pale skin, and hair. The great beauty of the Valyrians, with their hair of palest silver or gold, and eyes in shades of purple, not found amongst any other peoples of the world, is well known, and often held up as proof that the Valyrians are not entirely of the same blood as other men. Yet there are maesters who point out that, by careful breeding of animals, one can achieve a desirable result, and that populations in isolation often show quite remarkable variations from what might be regarded as common. This may be a likelier answer to the mystery of the Valyrian origins, although it does not explain the affinity with dragons that those with the blood of Valyria clearly had. As confusing as these traits might seem, the answer for Valyrians having these characteristics is simple. The Valyrians shared the blood of the dragon, the blood of a creature created by combining the wyvern and the fireworm. So, after understanding Valyrians share the blood of the dragon, and identifying the Great Empire's connections with blood magic, with examples such as brindled men, lizard men, eyeless cave people, winged men, and bloodless men, just as dragons are the product of blood magic, if Valyrians share the blood of the dragon, then the Valyrian race is likely what would be considered the product of blood magic as well. Basically, the product of a desired outcome, which is what our author may be hinting at with careful breeding being mentioned. At the same time, appearance and affinity for dragons was discussed. So, when looking more closely at the races of men found in Sothorios and beyond the Five Fourths, it is quite possible what we are seeing are failed attempts or prototypes of what would eventually become the Valyrian race. This would explain why the scaled, winged, and eyeless deformities seen in Targaryen stillbirths match many of the descriptions of other races described in both locations. This would also explain why the Valyrian race possesses the pale features not seen in any other culture descending from the Great Empire, but does, however, match the paleness of the Bloodless men. It is a result of their dragon blood, because within dragon blood lies the blood of a creature innately lacking in pigment. This is what causes this deep connection and affinity for dragons Valyrians have, and is directly related to the blood ties they share that others from the Great Empire do not. Blood ties written in blood magic, making Valyrians themselves magically connected and kin to those they would control. Well, that about wraps things up for today. Links to History of Westeros and Ideas of Ice and Fire videos are provided in the description box below. A special thank you goes out to the patrons who support this channel on Patreon. Your support has been greatly appreciated and encouraging. And to say thank you, the next video I have planned will be a patrons-only episode surrounding the fate of Alice Rivers. But in the meantime, I am planning to host a live stream with Lucifer Means Lightbringer on the topic of dragons and Arya Targaryen. LML has an essay called The Dracomorph Theory, surrounding Arya's worms and the mechanics our author may be conveying. So it should be an interesting discussion. So make sure to hit that bell to receive notifications.
If you like this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, hit the subscribe button, and leave a comment below. Thanks for watching!